Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know you have lots of choices, very exciting talks going on today. My name is Bathia Viejo Rose, I'm the first one up there on the list. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Archaeology, and I have the slightly long title for my lectureship, which is the Heritage and the Politics of the Past, which begins to introduce you to the way in which we approach heritage here. I'm also the director of the Heritage Research Center. And I guess one of the things, so we were going to have an event today to tell you about the center, right? And I thought, what best way or better way to do it than to, rather than me go on about it, to present you with some of our brilliant PhD students and have them tell you about the kind of research that they're doing, because I think that's where you'll get the exciting examples. Well, we hoped to tantalize you with the title. You will be getting football, Civil War, and elephants. But just to introduce a little bit, and I need to jump up. Okay. So what the center, so this is the Cambridge Heritage Research Center, right? And so heritage, the way we work at heritage here is not so much about collections and artifacts or old monuments, though those sometimes do come into it. But it's about all the kind of areas in which we feel that heritage is really central to our understanding of ourselves, our world, our visions of the past, of the present, and especially about the future. And one of the ways we think about it is really that heritage draws on the past as a resource, but it has huge future-making potential, because the choices we make about which pasts to remember, to talk about, to build monuments to, helps us to shape ourselves, determine who we are, what values we have, who we want to be as well, and where we want to go. And that's the future-making potential of heritage that we're really interested in. And then, of course, the kinds of issues around health, well-being, displacement, identity, where heritage is so central to the ways in which people make sense of those issues of themselves in the world, and especially in particularly uncertain, slightly frightening, very, very frightening moments where we live. That sense of having some sort of certainty to turn to, and heritage often becomes that anchor, that safety net. Right? Things are changing all around me. I don't know what's happening. Let me go to what I do know, what's safe. And yet heritage is, it's deceitful how stable it is, right? Because it's not that stable. It's actually constantly moving under our feet, constantly shifting, not only in our own sense of who we are and what our own personal heritage is, but also at the collective level, the community level, and the national level. And of course, in this country, we've seen these vast changes in how the heritage narrative has been written and rewritten over the past 10 years, quite dramatically. So the way we approach these is, there's the research and innovation in trying to address these core issues facing contemporary society through this lens or this tool, this intellectual and methodological tool of heritage, but also creating these, of course, learning opportunities for constantly expanding what it is that heritage is. So we don't take it for granted, the definition of heritage. We're constantly pushing and asking ourselves, what is this thing that we call heritage? How is it changing? Okay. And then, of course, one of our big ambitions, because heritage doesn't make sense as a purely theoretical exercise, is about policy and practice. How does these new understandings of heritage and the way people are using them and engaging with it, how does that translate into practice? How does that translate into policy? Increasingly in academia, we're thinking of heritage much more as intangible than tangible. What heritage means, what people value in it, the affective relationships. It's much more relational, right? It's about how I make sense of my relation to other people, to the world around me, to these spaces that I move into, to my place in time and history, these big questions, right? So it is about also trying to then inform practice. When you talk about, let's say, a big infrastructure project like the East-West Rail, right? Yes, the impact assessors go in and see what the different buildings are with listed status, but the affected communities are much more interested in what's this going to do to my landscape, to my heritage, to the place where my family grew up, to the place that I belong in when a railroad goes through it. So just doing a kind of list of the listed buildings doesn't quite cover that heritage landscape, if you like. So we're thinking much more about heritage as an ecosystem of relations between people, places, ideas, memories, narratives, and trying to pay attention and focus on those relationships rather than just the nodal points themselves. And so these are some of the themes that we're addressing in the Heritage Research Center. We have a long-term focus over 20 years working on conflict and its aftermath. How does conflict affect heritage? Not only what gets destroyed, but what heritage gets instrumentalized during conflicts through the propaganda, right? How do the borders of us and them of belonging shift during conflicts? And then how to deal with the aftermath of that. That it's not just about decisions about whether to rebuild or not rebuild or how to rebuild places like Palmyra, but also about what priority should be and how do you rebuild that? And what do you focus on first? And how do you integrate that into the community, right? And then heritage ecologies, which you will hear a little bit. So all of these are topics with conflict and post-conflict, which you will be hearing about from Stanley Onyemachalu in a moment. Ideas around heritage ecologies, where you'll be hearing about from Alyssa Santikarn, who's a recent doctor, also passed her viva over the summer. And then you will be hearing about identity, displacement, tangible and intangible, I think from all of them, and also from Josh Bland, who will be talking about football. So all of these are the issues that we're engaging with. And the big challenges in terms of the global sustainability development fund goals, these are the kinds of things that we feel that really, in order to begin to address these, you have to have a consideration and understanding of the heritage dimensions of some of these issues, right? That we're not going to be able to really find answers in terms of climate change and environment unless we get to understand why people are behaving the way they behave and how that's linked to their identity. If we want people to change, then we have to find ways of getting them to change in a way that is coherent with their lives and their values. And so much of what makes that coherent are these heritage narratives, again, at the individual, community, and national level as well. So we really feel that heritage is quite central to so many contemporary issues that we need to understand it much better and understand how it can become a positive driving force and positive tool rather than something that holds back and creates higher and higher walls, right? So that's really what we're about and what we're trying to do at the center in various ways. And these are just some of the publications that have come out of the center and the kinds of, we have weekly seminar series during term time, which now that we've all gone hybrid, you're all welcome to come to take part in. They happen on Thursdays at lunchtime. We have an annual lecture, which this year will happen in the beginning of March. We don't have a settled date yet, but a Thursday in the beginning of March, which will be given by Michael Hertzfeld, Professor Michael Hertzfeld from Harvard, who has worked in Greece and in Thailand also as an anthropologist and working on these issues around heritage. And we have an annual conference in May. And again, all of these are events that you're all very welcome to come to. And we also have during term time, fortnightly bulletin, which is a synthesis of all the research that's going on, not only here in Cambridge, but around the country and the world in heritage, right? Where we have also job openings, networks, opportunities, publications in this bulletin that comes out fortnightly. So all of these are things, if you wanted to continue to follow the work that we do, you're very welcome to join in. And without further ado, because I want you guys to speak, I'm going to start off by introducing Josh Bland, who is starting on the second year of his PhD, who also did his MPhil here with us in the Heritage MPhil program, which is in its third year. So heritage was always part of the archaeology MPhil, but 3 years ago, we decided to launch it as its own freestanding heritage MPhil. And Josh was in one of those first of those cohorts. And in doing so, we also went from having about 10 students every year to having 27 students. So this is really a growing field of interest. I think partly because younger people have understood how important heritage actually is to some of the pressing challenges facing us today. Josh.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Josh Bland and I, as Dacia says, am researching at the intersection of football and industrial heritage. And hopefully over the next 10, 15 minutes or so, by referring to some of the data that I've gathered from my pilot project based in Accrington in Lancashire, what I'm going to be able to do is not only just, outline exactly what I'm researching and how it's going to contribute to the wider field of heritage studies, but also maybe illuminate why I think football clubs or institutions like football clubs can play a really quite crucial role in contributing to solving some of sort of the global challenges facing us today, as defined by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So when thinking about the links between sort of the development of football in the UK and industrial culture, I mean, I would use the word primordial. Football, as we know it in this country, is of industry. I think there's 97 football clubs currently operating sort of down the football pyramid who came directly from a factory, some sort of works team, be that munitions, mines, ironworks. And the links between sort of football and industry are written into their badges, their nomenclature, nicknames, fan culture, you name it. It's a really, really deep connection there. And the team that I have sort of elected to concentrate my pilot project on, Accrington Stanley, are very, very typical of this. Accrington is for those who sort of don't know, is a sort of small industrial town in Lancashire, famous for brickmaking, cotton milling. And the club that would go on to become Accrington Stanley were actually founded at the sort of the town's late Victorian industrial zenith, namely as a way for workers to be able to spend their new sort of Saturday half days, their new leisure time, and their new expendable income. And the connection between the town's sort of industrial history and the actual sort of football club itself has become really, really layered over time. Despite the fact that I think there is sort of like a relatively obvious link between industry and football in the UK, it's not something that's really been picked up in critical heritage studies at all. There's really strong scholarships around football in sociology, social history, psychology, human geography, anthropology, but there's been no critical heritage work really done on the link between football and specifically industrial heritage. And I think there's a big gap there because there's been a shift in the last decade with regards to how football supporters themselves are actually referring to and talking about their relationships with the football club that they support. One of the first questions that I asked in the survey that I did as part of this pilot project was I asked supporters to just complete a simple tick box exercise. I listed a group of basically every cultural institution in the town and asked them to tick any cultural institution which they thought was important to the town's heritage. And obviously, as you can see from the result, Accrington Stanley, the local football club, was the most picked. 80% of those who answered the survey picked Accrington Stanley, which makes it, according to the people who answered the survey, more important than the town's war history and more important than the town's industrial history. And this is reflective of as I say, a much wider trend, whereby I think sort of existential threats to the game of football and football clubs nationwide itself. We've seen some really important old historic clubs actually liquidate over the last 2 or 3 years, just because of financial mismanagement, because of the impact of COVID. And there's been sort of protectionist narratives which have developed from within football communities, which have then gone on to actually influence policy and gone on to be enshrined in the recent Department of Media, Culture and Sports fan-led review of football, which basically says, as you can see from that quote in the middle there, football clubs are not simply economic assets, but are part of the heritage and culture of their local communities. So that is something that has grown from the grassroots and has basically started to influence policy decisions on the game. And with my research, I'm hoping to gain a greater understanding of football as heritage and understand and maybe articulate the experience and interactions between fan communities and their clubs. So my research, and again, I'd love to go into in a lot more detail, so I'm going to have to sort of summarize some points very, very quickly here, is basically my sort of preliminary research and data collection has hinted at 2 sort of fundamental points of departure. The first is that in towns such as Accrington, where the entire sort of social development of the town over the last sort of 120 years or so has been dependent on or based on the fact that there was industrialization there, the loss of industry in those towns brings about a state that I would call industrial ruination. It's a sort of space in between sort of the industrial and the post-industrial, whereby whilst the industry has actually left the town, the social architecture is such that the industry still remains the main cultural influence within these towns, and the sort of traumatic economic and sort of emotional consequences of losing industry sort of reverberate to, sort of between generations in these towns. And Accrington is an example of one of those sort of locations. The second is that football clubs are what I would describe as relics, in that they are sort of industry. They are formed and forged in the sort of the fire of the industrial social order, but have outlived this expiration of the industrial period in these towns. So they have sort of a functional continuity. Their use has basically remained the same, and they have sort of outlasted the industrial context into which they were born. And I want to sort of use this context to try and just go through some aspects of the data that I picked up and try and elucidate why I think football clubs are sort of really key sort of aspects of industrial heritage against this context. So the first thing to say is that my data is sort of grouped into two main pots. The first one is that I did some sort of ethnographic interviews with key players, members of staff at football clubs, key members of the fan communities, local journalists and local politicians. And the second sort of pot of data was sort of like a wide a social media distributed survey which was sort of mixed method with some free text and some sort of NPS scale I guess questions. Both of these pots of data seem to indicate to me that football fans almost exclusively refer to themselves in terms of community. Any question that I asked about sort of to what extent do you feel part of a community received a really strong response. And over in a sort of free text open-ended question that I asked on the survey about what does Accrington Stanley mean to you, over half of the respondents actively sort of stated some sort of synonym for community as the key aspect of their support. But actually, when you start to sort of drill in to the sort of the extended interview data, there's some really, really interesting stuff that comes out, I think, about how these communities are formed, what binds them, and how they operate. This is interview testimony from Ken Jefferson, who is probably my favorite interviewee that I shouldn't say that, but my favorite interviewee that I sort of talked to. And he's one of the few interviewees who actually has living memory of the industrial period in Accrington. I asked him sort of two questions here. I asked him exactly how he remembers the sort of the social dynamics of the industrial era in Accrington. And I asked him about the social experience of supporting Accrington today. And what was sort of matched between both questions was this sense that he was part of a sort of collectivist community. There was a sort of social ethic. People were bound together by a social value that, people in the immediate vicinity of you should be treated as kin. And that created a feeling of community. And this is a theme that was repeated throughout my research, was that people were basically picking up on specific social values. Here, the example here is sort of like a strong sense of local identity or a strong affinity to the town of Accrington itself. We're sort of suggesting that industry had initially given the town that sort of sense of people identified with the town because of the success of the industry. And that was then replicated in the now through the sort of on-field success of the football club. Now, to me, that suggests there's two things going on here. Excuse me. On the one hand, it suggests that this community operates as something similar to what Anthony Cohen would describe as a symbolic community. And Cohen's idea of symbolic community is that the community exists sort of in the realm of the imagination. It's not necessarily real geographic things that sort of render it a community. It's mutual subscription between members to specific social values. And the values that we've just looked at there, Jefferson's idea of like collectivist social endeavor or topophilic place identities, these are the values that the people who support Accrington Stanley subscribe to, and that's what renders the community real. The second thing that I think is going on here is the fact that those very same values which seem to me to form the bounds of this community seem to be actually sustained through the football club. So in this regard, I talked earlier about a football club being a relic, having a functional continuity from the industrial period of England into the now. it seems to me, and again, this is sort of preliminary research, I'm just going into my second year, that a football club can act as something of a cultural life jacket. Its relictum, its functional continuity, allows it to become almost a reservoir for specific sort of values born of the industrial era. And then those values can function to bind communities together. And that's basically what I want to research. I mean, the research questions that I'm now working with are basically centered around that idea. The idea that football clubs' functional continuity against a wider context of industrial trauma might mean that they can forge communities and empower supporters to maybe mitigate some of the worst traumatic effects of losing the industries in their towns. And I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to very, very quickly run through the last section. I made the promise at the start of this talk, obviously, to link to sustainable development goals. And obviously, the period that I'm talking about here, when sort of football, the sort of modern football landscape as we know it was formed in the industrial era, industrialization at that point was a very Western phenomenon. It was very highly localized, and increasingly it is a global phenomenon. And the nature of industry is that, to me, is that it goes into sort of different places where there's, you know, resources to be exploited and capitals to be generated. And industry is always going to be a temporary state of affairs because capital will always move on. But where industry does go, it sort of acts almost like a tent pole. Communities and societies sort of are generated around it. And when industry then moves on, those communities and societies which are sort of experience themselves in a state of permanence, that's a highly, highly traumatic thing to happen. I think that the lesson is that I think any industrializing society needs to have really, really strong social institutions, but it doesn't have to be a football club. It can be anything. It can be related to music halls, or it can be a political movement, but social institutions would outlast the expiration of any sort of industry there, because that will make communities sort of far more resilient and far more able to deal with the sort of the natural change which comes with processes of industrialization. But as a final point, I don't think it's sort of just about sort of direct impacts in terms of actually sort of helping communities deal with deindustrialization. I actually think that football clubs' main role in relation to global challenges is in their potential to be educative. One of the main takeaways from my data was the fact that the supporters of Accrington Stanley seem to use it as an educative tool, both to teach themselves about the history of their own community, but also to engage with wider global processes which were sort of unfolding around them. And this quote at the top here, this is again from Ken Jefferson, and it's one of my favorite quotes, is he's talking about how football has changed over the course of his lifetime. But to me, what he displays here is a really, really sort of textured knowledge or a textured understanding of how globalization processes are affecting him on a local scale in his own community, a strong knowledge of the sort of dangers of corrupt money or sort of problematic governance structures within sports. And in this sense, I think football can become a forum of understanding, a forum of education for people to really sort of get to grips with some of the biggest global challenges which are facing us. And especially at a time when football clubs and football governance organisations like FIFA or the FA are actively trying to sort of foster awareness of climate change, of food shortages, of sort of global medical emergencies, football's sort of big role to me is going to be as a forum of communication and reaching these communities in order to sort of plug them into global issues. So that brings me to the end of my spiel, and I'm now going to hand over to the fantastic Stanley, who's going to talk to you about heritage, conflict, and Nigeria.
Thanks very much, Josh. My name is Stanley Onyemichal, and as Josh said, I'll be speaking on heritage and the legacies of violent conflicts in the context of the Biafra War that happened in Nigeria between 1967 and 1970. So disclaimer, I am from Nigeria, and I am also from the Igbo part of Nigeria, which were like the secessionists at the time. So I'm providing here an insider perspective and a more nuanced narrative of how heritage, or how conflict rather, can impact on heritage in a way that has not been discussed before in the conflict heritage literature. But
is there a microphone you could use?
Sorry, can you?
Okay.
Can you hear me better now? Can you hear me better now?
Oh, well, just now when you spoke a bit louder, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll speak louder next time. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, I'll be speaking about violent conflict and post-conflict interventions, because that's where I want to kind of situate this talk to show how heritage can help or is useful in post-conflict interventions, and how heritage has this sort of dual side to it in sort of perpetuating conflict or addressing conflict in itself. And then I'll talk about the academic literature surrounding heritage and violent conflict generally, as well as where the knowledge gap is. And then I'll situate my case study within this knowledge gap to begin to explain sort of the relationship between heritage and violent conflicts, and how that relationship can help us in post-conflict interventions. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 16 talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And one big enemy of strong institutions is conflict or violent conflict. And that is also a threat to peace and, you know, a threat to justice everywhere in the world as well. However, the post-conflict interventions by many of these global peace structures, by which I mean the United Nations, the IMF, World Bank, and the rest of them, have been quite underwhelming, especially in areas like sub-Saharan Africa. And why is that? There are many theories as to why that is happening. But one of the biggest criticisms that relates to my talk today is one made by Millikan et al., saying that these institutions have failed to see conflict as a system that includes 4 of these main tenets, especially environmental, political, economic, and sociocultural tenets. And for me, I think, and I agree with Wagon and Bresco, who said that the sociocultural element of conflict is not given enough focus. So the United Nations, World Bank, and IMF oftentimes would deal with conflict, or would try to intervene in conflict, looking at the political nature of it, the economic impacts, and the environmental impacts, with little focus or with mismanaged or misdirected attention to the sociocultural impacts as well. And that is where actually heritage or cultural heritage comes in. So what is the relationship between violent conflict and heritage? First, we know that violent conflict has destructive effects on heritage, especially tangible cultural heritage. There's lots of research showing us how civil wars particularly affect tangible cultural heritage. We know that many case studies around the world have tried to suggest approaches to preventing these kinds of destruction. We also know that very little about how violent conflict impacts on intangible heritage. Again, we know about the insufficiencies of international conventions and treaties in protection of intangible heritage. And we know about the weaponization of heritage that is often the result of poorly executed post-conflict interventions. So sometimes these global peace structures would try to intervene, but they would focus more on, say, reconstructing the mosques or reconstructing bridges or temples or palaces that were destroyed, and neglecting the affective impacts that the war might have had on the communities, say their music, their way of life, their food, festivities, and every other aspect of intangible heritage. And we also know that intangible heritage amidst violence can help in conflict resolution and can help in addressing legacies of violent conflict as well. We've seen cases like that in Rwanda, especially where the green car policy, for example, the gifting of a cow to each member of the family helped in resolving legacies of the Rwandan genocide. People felt their identity were rebuilt just by the symbolism of those cows that were gifted to these families. And then finally, we've seen that museums currently are beginning to draw on cultural heritage to address legacies of violent conflicts, with the current restitution debate going around in the world. But what is missing? What don't we know, or what do we know little about in this conflict heritage literature? The first one is we know very little about the generative impacts of violent conflict on intangible heritage. And by generative, I mean how does conflict cause the creation or reinforcement of cultural heritage? Or how does conflict in itself becomes heritage in these communities, especially producing memories and memorial practices that stay even long after the conflict. Second, how can we understand the complex relationship between heritage and the legacies of the violent conflict? So now the conflict is over. What are the legacies that this conflict has brought in these communities, and how do they transform the heritage landscape? So are there new memorial sites? Are there, what is happening in this new area? And finally, what is the role of intangible heritage in post-conflict situations, and how can it be used to address or repair legacies of violent conflict? So these three gaps are the gaps that I have identified that we know very little or nothing about in the broader conflict heritage literature. And I suggest that, or I argue that by filling these gaps, we'll be able to contribute better to the post-conflict interventions in conflict and post-conflict communities around the world, and be able to achieve the United Nations SDG goal number 16. And so down to my case study, the Biafra War. So I'm going into my second year as well, like Josh. And so this was a result of my pilot study. And I wanted to understand, using the Biafran War, how to fill these gaps that I just enumerated. And first of all, to tell you about the war, it occurred shortly after colonialism ended between the years of 1967 to 1970. Nigeria, as you may already know, was colonized by the British Empire. And just 6 years after their independence in 1960, there was lots of political issues, and we can go about as to what were the remote causes and immediate causes of the war. But between 1967 and 1970, something very tragic happened in Nigeria. And it started after the now defunct Eastern region wanted to secede from the Nigerian state due to myriad of issues that they enumerated. And in that war, over 300,000 died in combat, and it's been estimated that over 1 million people, especially children, died from starvation. And over 3 million people were displaced and served as were refugees, and just caused displacement of 3 million people is the rough estimate. And now, using this case study, I'm trying to understand 3 questions. First, how did the Biafra War impact on cultural heritage in Igbo land? And second, what or who is remembered or memorialized from the war and why? And finally, what are the legacies of the Biafra-Nigeria War, and how have they transformed the heritage landscape of the Igbo? So these 3 questions, I feel, will help me understand or fill the 3 gaps that I enumerated before. But for this talk, I want to focus on just the first one. How did the war impact on cultural heritage in Igbo land? And like I explained in the sort of literature review that I showed in those tables, there's not been enough focus on the generative impacts, because of course, civil wars or violent conflicts are destructive by nature. And so lots of research has focused on those destructive impacts rather than on these generative or creative impacts that I've sort of found in my case study. And I use these following methods to be able to understand this problem. That's a map of Nigeria there with the 5 southeastern states. This is not the entire eastern region that fought the Biafran War, but one of the impacts or one of the legacies of that war was that the geographical maps of Nigeria were redrawn to sort of stifle the powers of the then eastern region governor. And so now the Igbo people are sort of confined within these 5 southeastern states. We still find lots of them in Delta, which is now south-south rather than southeast. Some of them in Rivers State, which is also south-south, and all of that. So my research will be focusing on just these 5 states for brevity and also for feasibility. So I conducted 1-month pilot study in Nsukka, in Enugu State particularly, and I did field site visits, some interviews and documentary research to understand my questions. And the result of that is in two parts. So I show the impact on tangible heritage, which is not really my focus, but of course, tangible heritage, like cultural spaces and sacred spaces were impacted. And so I show that, and I also show the impact on intangible heritage as well. And what has resulted, or what I have found, is within the tangible heritage of the Igbo people in Nsukka, the Biafran War had two basic or two broad impacts on them. One was destructive impacts and one was generative impacts. And on the destructive impacts, these are things we already know. There were cultural sacred spaces, they were decimated. There was domicide, which is the destruction of homes and people were displaced. There was loss of cultural properties, markets, farms, and the rest of that. Lots of stories showing that. But on the generative sides, we've seen that the war contributed to their tangible heritage, because now there are memorial sites, there are museum exhibitions and memorial centers dotted across this community. They also have personal mementos to the war, many of them who survived the war or whose parents fought in the war, and had little pieces of items that they would show me and say, oh, I feel really attached to this war. I'm proud that my father fought here. Or, I still feel the trauma and I don't want to talk about it. So you still see those kinds of things, and memoirs as well. And I just explained the geographical boundaries that have come to, that they have come to know as home now, because usually they saw themselves as this big Igbo community or this big territory called Biafra, but the Nigerian government, with help from their friends abroad, was able to redraw their geographical boundaries, create more states, and divide these communities much more. Now we have like autonomous communities with kings and political kings, placed on them just to hone in their powers and make sure that such collective angst against the Nigerian state does not reoccur. Yes, yeah, okay, I'll rush that. Here's one quote from, I can't quite read it all, but what this person was trying to say was when the soldiers came into their house during the war, that one of their children ran into the Obi. Obi in Igbo land is this sacred space. It's like a shrine that is in every community. And they said, they felt it, because normally before the war, when things were all right, people would not go into your Obi. If you ran into your Obi, you were considered safe for some reason. But during the war, the soldiers went there and grabbed their sons. And so they felt that their God failed them, and the place was desecrated and all of that. So you see those emotions coming out in the talk that I had with these people. And I can explain that further during the Q&A. But mostly the main thrust of my work, and the part I'm most proud about, is the intangible heritage, the impact the war had on the intangible heritage. There were destructive impacts and disruptive impacts, because intangible heritage is not something that you can touch and feel. It's usually music, festivals, food, dance, traditional knowledge, belief systems, traditional know-hows. So they weren't quite destroyed as such, like the tangible heritage, but they were disrupted. Many cultural calendars were disrupted. Many traditional practices were disrupted during the war. And then after the war, they were transformed. For example, I have a quote where somebody was telling me that traditional marriages became more expensive after the war because people used marriages as a form of economic survival, as a form of economic rebound. And so the bride price and the list of items that you would buy before you take a wife sort of skyrocketed. You had more tubers of yams, more things to provide for the family. And yeah, so there were also generative impacts like memorial practices, the dance, the Ojile dance in Nsukka. There was a particular kind of food that was, developed during the war, or sort of reinforced into the mainstream of the Igbo people culinary dish during the war, called abacha. It existed before the war, but it was regarded as a poor man's food because it had little nutrients and all. But during the war, it became the mainstay because it lasted for longer. It needed less things to be able to prepare it with. And after the war, it has continued to today to become this food of status. So if you go to a party and you're served abacha, you are considered very valuable to the host. So these are some of the generative impacts that the war had. And these are some quotes from the people. I just made the marriage quote. I just read that quote to you. And then there was somebody talking about the war taking away peace and truth from their community and all of that. So to conclude, going into my second year, more research will be carried out in the 4 other communities that I showed you in the map. This study will further go on to study or explore how the legacies of the war has transformed the Igbo heritage landscape. It will also explore the dissonances in the canonization, representation, and memorialization of the war between the federal government and the Igbo people themselves. So these two people have conflicting narratives of the war, and the federal government is pushing that through its National War Museum, and the Igbo people are looking for alternative avenues to tell their own stories about the war. And also I'll explore the relationship between cultural heritage and violent conflicts in order to contribute to how we reimagine the effectiveness of post-conflict interventions in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world. And finally, to highlight the roles or potentials of intangible heritage in these interventions, including identity reformation, resilience, transitional justice, and peace building. Thank you very much.
So hi, my name is Elisa. As Dathia mentioned, I recently finished my PhD in the archaeology department here at Cambridge. And today I'll be talking to you about my research on elephants. So what do elephants have to do with heritage? As Dathia, Josh, and Stanley have hopefully shown you by now, heritage is more than buildings and monuments. Heritage can be intangible and tangible. It can also be natural or cultural. Elephants can be heritage. So for my PhD research, I worked with an indigenous community known as the Gui, who live in the northeast of Thailand in Surin province, which sits on the border with Cambodia. For centuries and up until the 1960s, the Gui would catch wild elephants, and this was an incredibly important part of their heritage. In fact, the Gui community that I worked with are known as the Gui Ajiang, or the elephant people. Now, there were a few reasons why the tradition of elephant catching ended. The main one was political conflict between Thailand and Cambodia in the 1950s that ultimately shut the border between the two countries. This disrupted the Gui's traditional elephant catching route that would take them across the border into Cambodia, into the Dang mountain ranges. Then there's also wildlife legislation, national and international, protecting the Asian elephant. This legislation came later, but it made a return to the tradition of elephant catching impossible for the Gui. My research sought to understand the impact of the exclusion of the Gui and more generally of indigenous and minority communities from top-down decisions made regarding the definition and protection of heritage. While the Gui are indigenous, Thailand doesn't acknowledge the existence of indigenous peoples within the country. The Thai state was built upon quite rigid and reified boundaries of who is and is not Thai, what they look like, how they act, and what their heritage is. The Gui don't fit neatly within that definition of Thainess, and that means their heritage isn't seen as heritage and isn't considered worth protecting. When the Thai-Cambodian border was shut, and when legislation to prevent the capture of wild elephants was implemented, the impact these actions on the Gui and their heritage wasn't considered. So what were those impacts? Through my research, which consisted of fieldwork in Surin between 2018 and 2020, conducting interviews and participant observation with the Gui, I found 3 main aspects of their heritage were endangered following the end of elephant catching. That was the role of the Ma Chang, or the elephant catchers themselves, the knowledge of making the bakam rope, or the lasso used to catch elephants, and knowledge of the Pasa Pipa, or the forest spirit language, which was a language spoken only in the context of a wild elephant capture, only in the wild forest, and spoken only by the elephant catchers. So starting with the Ma Chang, It may seem obvious that the end of elephant catching impacted the elephant catchers. But one thing that is a bit less obvious that emerged in my research was that this produced an intergenerational conflict between the younger and the older Ma Chang. Even though wild elephant catching has ended, there are still Ma Chang in Surin. However, today, they take on mostly a symbolic role. They lead ceremonies and worship, and they maintain quite a high rank in Gui society. The conflict emerges in whether you think someone can be a real elephant catcher if they never have and never will catch an elephant. One thing to note is that while wild elephants are protected under Thai legislation, there is still a legal domesticated elephant industry in the country. The younger Ma Chang have been reenacting the wild elephant captures using these domesticated elephants in order to keep their tradition alive. However, the older generation doesn't think this is a legitimate substitute. Here are some of the responses of the Ma Chang that I interviewed. I found that all of the older generation, and I should say when I say older generation, I mean those that were alive to experience a wild elephant catch for themselves, whether successful or not. But they view the new Ma Chang as less authentic because they lack this elephant catching experience. They see them as play acting in the role. As Bunma Sandy says in the first quote, "You can't be a real Ma Chang unless you catch elephants." Some of the younger Ma Chang feel similarly, as you can see in the second quote, but others disagree and they don't see a difference. So as Noon says, we're no different from the older Ma Chang. Intergenerational conflict also emerged in the second endangered tradition, which is the pagam rope or the lasso used to catch elephants. So the man you can see here, that's Bunma Sandy. He's currently the highest ranked Ma Chang, and apparently he's the only one who has knowledge of the rope making process. The pagam rope is about 30 to 40 meters long, and it's made of braided leather from 3 water buffalo. And there are 2 important parts to the rope making process. There's the physical aspect of braiding the rope, which you can see being done in the picture here, and that takes about 6 men. Bunma is in his late 90s now, so he does not do the physical aspect of rope making. He oversees the younger men braiding the rope. What he's in charge of is the spiritual aspect of rope making. So when the pagam rope is made, it's imbued with the ancestors of the person that it's made for. It's also imbued with the spirit of the pagam god. This is the part of the rope making process that Bunma hasn't shared with any of the other Ma Chang, and he will not share this knowledge. This is because spirits are dangerous and you need to be powerful to work with them. He can only pass on his knowledge of someone of equal rank to his own, and that's someone who's been to the forest and caught 30 wild elephants, which is no longer possible. So according to Bunma, this knowledge will die with him. And as he told me, I can't do anything about it. If the knowledge is lost, that's just how it is. However, where Bunma thinks the tradition ends with him, the younger Ma Chang I spoke to disagree. They told me they know how to make the rope. They don't care if they don't include the spiritual aspect of the rope making process, as long as the physical ropes continue to be made. And they said they'll keep making the rope after Bunma dies, although Bunma does not know this. Now, the final endangered aspect of Gui heritage hasn't been adapted by the younger generation, and that's knowledge of the Pasa Pipa, the forest spirit language. And this language will likely be lost in the next few years, as the only people who know how to speak it are in their late 90s and haven't passed it on to anyone. Their reason for refusing is that this language can only be spoken in the wild forest. And when the Thai government implemented legislation to protect the nation's forests, these spaces, in the eyes of the Gui, ceased to be wild. They became human. So as you can see from the quotes on this slide, you can only speak the Pasa Pipa in the wild forest. You can't learn it at home, and there's no place to speak it now. Now, loss and adaptation are part of the natural process of heritage. Heritage is a living thing, and it doesn't exist without people. Heritage is enacted and transmitted by people, so it'll always entail change in some way, And sometimes that change may be the end of a tradition. So my research isn't saying that it's necessarily a bad thing that these changes are happening to GUI culture. The problem is that these changes have been forced upon the GUI due to their exclusion from state structures. The GUI people and their culture weren't valued by the Thai state, and so they weren't considered when decisions were made that severely impacted not only their heritage, but their very identities. One thing my research illustrates is how entangled nature and culture are, and how environmental policies can have severe impacts on communities and their heritage when the relationship between people and nature isn't understood and isn't accounted for. Yes, environmental conservation, broadly speaking, is a good thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. And yes, the Asian elephant needed to be protected from extinction. However, the protection of the Asian elephant and the regulation of Thailand's forest spaces also had massive consequences for the GUI. It resulted in the endangerment and irreparable loss of important parts of their heritage. And these consequences were never considered when this legislation was developed and implemented. My research also highlights how heritage and identity are deeply tied, and heritage is incredibly potent and political. The changes to GUI culture following the end of wild elephant catching have meant that the GUI people don't relate to their culture in the same way. It's impacted their future, and they don't view their traditions as authentic anymore. When a state defines what is heritage, it also defines what isn't heritage. And communities whose culture isn't valued are threatened by this definition. But on the other side of the coin, heritage also has incredible potential to be used to empower these communities. Inclusion and recognition can strengthen and affirm identities, which is why heritage is an important concern when we're talking about the future and issues like sustainable development, equality, and social well-being. And it's why heritage of all communities needs to be considered as a part of policymaking, because heritage is a human right. And that's my time, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, the three of you, so much. I hope that has given you a taster for the range of the kind of research that we do and the way we approach heritage. I'm sorry we went overboard in terms of time. I think that's also a testament to how passionate our students are about their topics and how invested they are in them. We do have a few minutes for questions if you have any. Yes, I think you might need to wait for the roaming mic so that our online participants can hear your questions. Thank you.
You talked about the destructive and generative effects of the war in Biafra. I assume that the North was trying to, in some senses, destroy the cultural heritage of the Igbo people to break them in the war. The heritage or the culture that comes out of that for the Igbo people, do you have any views on what is the most useful new formulation, given that they suffered terribly and now have to live in Nigeria for all intents and purposes? There's not going to be another war, as far as I know. Is there a sort of a reforming, a positive reforming of that heritage that can come out of it that would actually help the people to move forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really tricky to assign the value positive to it because there are so many people feeling so many things at the same time. But I can tell that for the most part, that sense of rebuilding or rebounding, there's been that we were victims, but we don't want to be victimized, and we don't want to have that victim mentality. And so we must push forward. We must go into the diaspora. So like there's this idea within Igbo people and even other Nigerians that the Igbos travel the farthest, and so many people trace that, including Achebe, Chinua, back to the Biafran War and the legacies of that. And then there's also this funny ascription or relationship to the Jews. There's been lots of debates and debunked statements about the Igbos' tie to the Jews, that some of them see themselves till today as the lost tribes of Israel. And so they felt that how the Jews were able to rebound from their Holocaust experience is the way they too are rebounding from their experience, and now they're going to own properties and sort of become rich and become better than their counterparts in Nigeria. So there's those dual sort of collective philosophies, within the community. I don't know if that answers the question. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Hi, question for Josh. You talk about post-industrial towns and football clubs. Is hanging on to the football club, I mean, is it unhealthy? I mean, I'm from Scotland and lots of Scottish junior football clubs have lost their industry in the same way. You didn't really say whether it was helpful or not. It certainly defines how lots of people think in SA Accrington.
Yeah.
You didn't really say if we need to get away from that, or in fact it's helpful to post-industrial relic.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And this is just sort of based off only sort of like the first year of my research. The impression that I got certainly in Accrington is that people found having that sort of link through time to an institution that sort of connected them to their industrial past as sort of an anchoring influence. I think it's sort of, especially in Accrington, which is a town which is in the, I think, the top 10 deprived sort of urban areas of the UK, really sort of poor educational infrastructure, and a sort of bit of a brain drain as well going on in the town. I think having that sort of link back, that sort of stabilizing cultural asset in the town was generally helpful. But there were, I mean, to your point, there were a couple of people who, through the survey work, and they were minority voices who did say that they want the town to sort of move on from the past and to sort of try and establish a new identity. So the overwhelming picture that I got was that it was sort of this sort of like stabilizing force, but there were sort of dissenting voices to that.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts?
This is for Josh. When you're conducting your research,
Yeah.
asking open-ended questions about what the club means to you, you spoke about community being more than half of what people answered.
Yeah.
What were the other sort of tangible or intangible reasons people gave?
Yeah, I mean, there were loads. I think when I sort of codified my data, there was something like I categorized those sort of open-ended free text questions into something like 21 different factors that people brought up when answering them. The other sort of really dominant ones were sort of directly to do with connection to place, or sort of like an actual sort of geographic anchoring to a specific location, in this case, Accrington. And the other thing was a connection to family. I think a lot of time, and this is sort of like an underappreciated aspect maybe in academia of football culture, is I think there's an overemphasis on geography and place. And actually, if you look at, I mean, for example, I support West Bromwich Albion, but I've never actually lived in West Bromwich at all. I've lived in sort of like the Midlands area. The football club to me has been passed down almost like a family heirloom. And it's that sort of transmittance, which is how a football club passes between generations, and as someone comes to support a football club. So those were the big two, is that connection to family and connection to sort of a location, which were the other ones that really sort of popped out. Thank you.
And I think one of the things you can hear, I mean, we've talked about the way heritage gets politicized, right? Gets used to construct us and them, to build barriers. But I think a lot of what the research that our students are doing, that we're doing at the center, is, okay, we need to understand that, but we need to understand how that works in order to understand how heritage can also be about resilience. And I'm sorry to use that word. What I mean about it is more a sense of how it can be about building community. And often, I don't know if you heard it, but there's a line linking all of these where heritage is also about finding dignity and finding one's space. And the kind of pride of that space and that dignity of who we are and what we can contribute to the world. It's not just about kind of flag planting, right? It can also be about who are we and what can we give, and how can we build, and how can we contribute? And I think that's the dimension where it can potentially be positive and not just about flag waving and wall building. And we will need to understand that better, not just assume that it can do that. And that's one of the things where large organizations like UNESCO often fall a little bit in the trap of assuming that heritage can be a force of good. We need to understand better how it can be a force for division and conflict and violations of human rights, in order to understand better how it can be a constructive force as well. So we're kind of enmeshed in all of that process and coming at it, as you have heard, from lots of different angles. And I think the more we understand how it can be harnessed in that way, and how it functions as this kind of ecosystem of connections, the more it can be also used as a tool for positive future building. And that's about dialogue and understanding, and not about building higher and higher walls between people and individuals. Is our time up? It is. Thank you all so much for coming, and we're all here.
Thank you.